The first-class lounge was buzzing with quiet excitement as passengers lined up to board the long flight to New York. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and perfume. A tall man in a dark blue suit stood proudly in line, tapping his expensive leather shoes on the polished floor. His name was Richard, a businessman who believed the world should know his status the moment he entered a room. His gold watch glistened under the lounge lights, and he made sure to adjust his tie so others would notice. Richard had always loved traveling in first class. It wasn't just the wider seats or the fine dining that made him feel important. It was the sense of being above the rest, separated from the ordinary crowd sitting in economy. For him, flying wasn't just about reaching a destination, it was about showing people he belonged to a special class. When boarding began, Richard strutted down the jet bridge with confidence, like a king walking into his castle. The flight attendant greeted him warmly, and he returned the smile with a nod that said, "Yes, I deserve this seat." He placed his luggage in the overhead bin and sat down comfortably, stretching his arms as if he owned the entire row. As more passengers entered, Richard's eyes scanned the cabin. He loved to guess who was successful, who was wealthy, and who was just lucky to be there. That's when his gaze landed on a man sitting across the aisle, a little farther down. The man wore a simple black t-shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed brown boots. His hair was slightly messy, and he carried a small, worn backpack instead of a sleek designer bag. He wasn't talking loudly, nor was he drawing attention to himself. He just sat quietly, holding a paperback book in his hands. Richard frowned immediately. Something about this man didn't fit his idea of first class. The seat looked too luxurious for someone dressed so casually. In Richard's eyes, first class was for people like him, sharply dressed, wealthy, and polished. He leaned toward the flight attendant, who was helping another passenger nearby, and whispered with a smirk, "Are you sure everyone here belongs in first class?" The attendant, trained to keep her composure, simply smiled politely and continued her work. But Richard wasn't done. He chuckled to himself and shook his head, clearly annoyed that someone like that man was sitting so close to him. The quiet man across the aisle didn't look up from his book. He seemed perfectly at peace, flipping the pages slowly, as if the world around him didn't matter. His posture was calm, almost gentle. The contrast between him and Richard couldn't have been stronger. A few more passengers walked in, and Richard made sure to sit upright, adjusting his tie again. He wanted to look powerful. But deep inside, he couldn't stop staring at the man in casual clothes. His mind began creating stories. Maybe the airline had made a mistake. Maybe the man had used points, or perhaps he was upgraded for free. Whatever the reason, Richard felt annoyed. First class should have standards, Richard muttered under his breath, though loud enough for the person next to him to hear. That person, a middle-aged woman in a grey sweater, glanced at him briefly but chose not to respond. The engines roared faintly outside as the last few passengers boarded. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, creating a soft golden glow. Flight attendants moved gracefully, offering welcome drinks. Richard accepted a glass of sparkling water with lemon, holding it as if it were champagne. The man across the aisle quietly took plain water and thanked the attendant in a soft, genuine voice. Richard rolled his eyes. Even his drink is boring, he thought. Time passed, and the plane prepared for takeoff. Passengers fastened their seatbelts, the announcements played, and the aircraft began rolling toward the runway. As the engines grew louder, Richard's eyes wandered again to the man reading his book. There was something unusual about the way he carried himself. He didn't act intimidated, nor did he seem out of place. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. If anything, he seemed almost humble. But humility wasn't something Richard valued. To him, appearances meant everything. And so, instead of appreciating the man's calmness, Richard allowed his irritation to grow. When the plane finally lifted off the ground, Richard leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and smiled smugly. He was living his version of luxury, and he wanted everyone to know it. But as he opened his eyes again, his gaze returned once more to the quiet man across the aisle. The man didn't notice him. He was still absorbed in his book, a faint smile resting on his lips as if he was enjoying every page. Richard let out a quiet scoff. He whispered to himself, probably some nobody who just got lucky. The truth, however, was about to surprise him in ways he never imagined. For now, though, the scene was simple: a proud businessman, secure in his arrogance, and a mysterious quiet man whose presence seemed ordinary yet extraordinary. The stage was set for a lesson Richard didn't know he was about to learn. And as the plane soared higher into the clouds, the difference between the two men became more obvious. One lived for appearances. The other, though unknown to Richard, carried a reputation greater than any luxury seat could ever hold. Richard sipped his drink, convinced he already understood the world around him. But life has a way of humbling even the proudest hearts, often when they least expect it. The quiet man across the aisle turned another page of his book, completely unaware or perhaps completely unconcerned that someone was silently judging him. But soon, the truth would be revealed. And when it was, Richard's world and his opinion of what truly makes someone first class would change forever. The plane was now high above the clouds, cruising steadily. The seatbelt sign was turned off, and passengers began to relax. Some opened laptops, others closed their eyes to rest, and a few browsed through the entertainment system. The atmosphere in first class was calm, filled with the faint clinking of glasses and the soft voices of attendants moving gracefully down the aisle. Richard leaned back in his wide leather seat, adjusting the small pillow behind his neck. He glanced at the menu card that had been handed out. Dishes with fancy French names tempted him, though he barely cared what they tasted like. For him, ordering in first class was another way of showing status. He always chose the most expensive-sounding meal and spoke the names loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear. He lifted his eyes again and saw the man across the aisle, the same man in faded jeans and a simple t-shirt. He was still reading, still calm, still silent. He didn't seem impressed by the luxury around him. No wine glass in his hand, no fancy meal in front of him, just a quiet focus on the book he carried. Richard felt a prick of irritation. How could someone sit in first class and not act impressed? To Richard, this man looked out of place, and that thought kept bothering him. His lips curled into a small, arrogant smile as he thought of something sharp to say. When the attendant came by to take meal orders, Richard waited for his turn with exaggerated importance. "Yes," he said in a loud, clear voice, "I'll have the truffle risotto and the seared salmon. Make sure the wine is chilled properly." He leaned back as if he had just signed a big business deal. Then the attendant turned to the man in jeans. The man looked up from his book with a gentle smile and said softly, "Just the chicken, please. And water is fine for me." Richard couldn't resist. He leaned forward slightly and chuckled. "Chicken and water? In first class? You do know this isn't economy, right?" His tone carried a sting, though his smile was polished. The man simply nodded and replied, "That's all I need, thank you." Then he went back to his book, not showing even a hint of offense. This calm reaction frustrated Richard even more. He expected embarrassment, maybe even anger. But instead, the man seemed untouched by the insult. Richard leaned back, shaking his head, and muttered just loud enough for the woman next to him to hear, "Some people don't belong here. They really should check who they're selling these seats to." The woman gave him a quick glance, her eyes filled with disapproval, but she didn't reply. Richard was used to making comments and being the center of attention, but this time, it felt like people were quietly judging him instead. Still, his pride wouldn't let him stop. As dinner service began, Richard made small, exaggerated noises of satisfaction with every bite of his meal, as though he was performing for an audience. He wanted the man across the aisle to notice what he was missing. But the man didn't look up once. He was content with his simple meal, eating slowly, then wiping his hands with a napkin before returning to his book. Richard's irritation boiled inside. He leaned slightly toward the aisle and said in a louder voice, "You know, first class is for people who've earned it. People who work hard, succeed, and can afford it. Not for, well, people who don't even know how to enjoy it." This time, several passengers turned their heads. A few frowned. One older gentleman narrowed his eyes at Richard but said nothing. The cabin grew tense for a moment. The man in jeans finally closed his book and looked up. His eyes were calm, steady, and filled with kindness. He smiled gently and said, "Everyone here deserves to be treated with respect. Whether they're in first class or economy, it doesn't change who they are as a person." His words were simple, but they carried weight. For a brief second, Richard felt something inside him stir like a mirror had been placed in front of him. But his pride was stronger than his conscience. He forced a laugh, waving his hand dismissively. "Spoken like someone who doesn't belong here," he said. The man didn't reply. He simply opened his book again, as though the conversation had never happened. His silence wasn't weak, it was powerful. It made Richard feel small, though he refused to admit it to himself. A little later, turbulence shook the plane lightly. Glasses rattled, and some passengers tightened their grip on the armrests. Richard had his laptop open on the tray table, working on a presentation. The sudden shake caused his bag, which he had carelessly left unzipped, to tip over. Papers spilled onto the floor, sliding into the aisle and under nearby seats. Richard cursed under his breath, embarrassed as he scrambled to gather them. His face grew hot, not only from the mess but also from the thought of others watching. Before he could bend fully to pick them up, a pair of hands reached out calmly, collecting the loose sheets with care. It was the man in jeans. He crouched down, gently gathering each page, stacking them neatly, and handing them back with a smile. "Here you go," he said kindly. Richard took them, mumbling a quick, "Thanks," without looking the man in the eye. His pride was wounded, and the kindness only deepened the discomfort. He shoved the papers back into his bag, zipped it quickly, and leaned back in his seat. The other passengers noticed. Some gave small smiles at the man's gesture, others exchanged glances as if silently saying, "Who's the real gentleman here?" Richard avoided eye contact with anyone. He stared at the seat in front of him, feeling something he wasn't used to: shame. The plane steadied again, the turbulence passing. The cabin returned to normal, but for Richard, nothing felt normal anymore. His earlier confidence had cracked slightly. The man across the aisle had shown him up, not with wealth, not with arrogance, but with a simple act of kindness. Richard wanted to dismiss it, to convince himself it didn't matter. But deep inside, a question began to form, one he didn't want to answer: who really belongs in first class? The man with money and pride, or the man with kindness and humility? As the hours of the flight stretched on, Richard found himself glancing again and again at the quiet stranger. There was something about him, something he couldn't quite place. The man didn't seek attention, yet attention seemed to follow him. Even in his silence, there was dignity. Even in his simple clothes, there was grace. Richard didn't know it yet, but the biggest surprise was still waiting. The truth about the quiet man would soon be revealed, and when it was, Richard's arrogance would shatter completely. For now, though, he sat in his wide leather seat, sipping his wine, pretending to be unbothered. But his mind kept replaying the moment the man had handed him his papers with that gentle smile. And though he wouldn't admit it, Richard felt smaller, while the quiet man somehow seemed larger. The stage was quietly shifting. The insult had been spoken, the kindness had been shown, and the truth was waiting just ahead, ready to change the way everyone on that plane saw the man in faded jeans. The long flight settled into its quiet rhythm. Outside the windows, the sky was painted in shades of soft orange and purple as the sun began to set, casting a glow across the cabin. Some passengers pulled their blankets closer and closed their eyes, while others watched movies or worked on their laptops. Richard sat stiffly in his seat, pretending to focus on his laptop screen. But his mind wasn't really on the numbers and charts glowing in front of him. Instead, it kept wandering back to the moment when the man in jeans had picked up his scattered papers. He could still see that calm smile and hear the gentle words, "Here you go." The memory stung. It wasn't the act itself that bothered him, it was the way it had made him feel. For a brief moment, Richard had been vulnerable, embarrassed. And the man he had mocked was the one who had helped him without hesitation. The irony was hard to swallow. Richard shifted in his seat, trying to push the thought away. But no matter how much he tried to drown it in work, he couldn't ignore the fact that other passengers had witnessed the scene. He had tried to make the man look small, yet in the end, he was the one who had looked foolish. The flight attendant passed by again, offering coffee. Richard accepted with a polite nod, trying to mask his discomfort with a professional smile. The man in jeans also accepted a cup, thanking the attendant warmly. There was something in his voice, a kindness that carried no effort, as if it was his natural way of being. Richard glanced sideways, almost without realizing it. He noticed how the man held the cup gently, blowing softly on the hot surface before taking a sip. No rush, no pretension. Just quiet contentment. He seemed like the kind of person who was fully present in each small moment, while Richard himself was always chasing the next big one. That thought unsettled him even more. A few minutes later, a young passenger from economy walked up to the curtain that separated the cabins. She looked a little nervous, holding a phone in her hand. She whispered something to the flight attendant, who then nodded with a kind smile. After a moment, the attendant walked over to the man in jeans. "Sir," she said softly, "this young lady has asked if she could take a picture with you. Only if you're comfortable." Richard raised his eyebrows in confusion. "A picture? With him?" He looked around, half expecting the attendant to be talking to someone else. But no, she was clearly speaking to the man across the aisle. The man smiled warmly and nodded. "Of course," he said, standing up. The young passenger's face lit up with excitement. She quickly walked over, holding her phone tightly. "Thank you so much," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. The man put his arm gently around her shoulder, and they both smiled for the photo. Afterward, he shook her hand softly and said, "Take care of yourself." The girl walked back toward economy, grinning from ear to ear, holding her phone like it was the most valuable thing in the world. Richard stared, puzzled. Who was this man? Why did she want a picture with him? He leaned slightly toward the woman sitting next to him and whispered, "Do you know who that is?" The woman gave him a surprised look. "You don't recognize him?" she asked quietly. Richard shook his head. She smiled faintly, as though amused. "That's Keanu Reeves." The name hit Richard like a sudden gust of wind. His eyes widened, and for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. Keanu Reeves, the world-famous actor, known across the globe for blockbuster movies, yet equally known for his humility and kindness. Richard blinked several times, his mind racing back through every comment he had made, every insult he had thrown. He felt his face burn with embarrassment. "I mocked him. I laughed at him. I said he didn't belong here." Meanwhile, Keanu quietly sat back down, returning to his book as if nothing unusual had happened. There was no air of celebrity around him, no demand for attention. He was exactly the same as before, calm, kind, and humble. Richard's chest tightened. The shame he had been holding earlier now grew heavier. He had been so busy trying to prove himself, so desperate to show his importance, that he hadn't even realized he was sitting near someone far greater than he could ever claim to be. As the truth settled in, Richard noticed how other passengers looked at Keanu. Not with awe in the sense of fame, but with genuine admiration. A quiet respect filled the cabin, unspoken yet clear. People were moved not by his stardom but by his humility. The businessman's earlier arrogance now felt like a heavy coat he no longer wanted to wear. But it was too late, he couldn't take back the words he had said. The flight continued, and dinner plates were cleared away. Some passengers began to sleep. Richard, however, couldn't find peace. He kept replaying his own voice in his head, "First class is for people who've earned it." How foolish those words sounded now, directed at a man who had earned not just success but also respect in ways Richard could never imagine. For a long time, he sat in silence, staring at the ceiling of the cabin. Finally, he stole one more glance at Keanu. The actor was now leaning back with his eyes closed, resting peacefully, completely unaware of or perhaps completely unconcerned by the storm of guilt brewing inside Richard. The moment felt surreal. Here was a man with fame, fortune, and global recognition, sitting humbly in jeans and boots, asking for nothing more than chicken and water, helping others without hesitation. And there sat Richard, in his expensive suit, clutching his pride like a trophy, yet feeling smaller than he ever had before. The contrast was clear. The turning point had arrived. Richard now understood something he had never truly believed before: true greatness has nothing to do with wealth or appearances. It comes from character, from kindness, from the way a person treats others when nobody is watching. As the night sky outside grew darker and the plane hummed steadily, Richard sat quietly in his seat, realizing the truth he had been blind to. And for the first time in a long time, the proud businessman felt humbled. The night sky stretched endlessly outside the cabin windows, a blanket of darkness sprinkled with tiny stars. The plane moved steadily, the soft hum of the engines creating a gentle background sound that almost lulled people into sleep. Most passengers in first class had begun to relax, some watching movies with their headphones on, others wrapped in warm blankets. Richard, however, sat wide awake. His mind was restless, filled with thoughts that refused to settle. The name still echoed in his head: Keanu Reeves. He had replayed the woman's words over and over: "You don't recognize him? That's Keanu Reeves." At first, he couldn't believe it. But as he looked again, really looked, the pieces started to fit. The familiar face, the calm voice, the quiet kindness. He had seen Keanu in movies years ago, fighting villains, saving the world, performing daring stunts. But here, in real life, there were no cameras, no scripts, no spotlight. Just a man sitting quietly, reading his book, treating everyone with respect. Richard felt the weight of his earlier words pressing down on him like a heavy stone. First class is for people who've earned it. He had mocked the very man who had earned more than he could ever dream of, yet chose to live simply, without flaunting his success. The shame grew sharper with every memory. His loud remarks about people who don't belong, his smug laugh at the chicken and water order, his whispered insults to the flight attendant. And through it all, Keanu had remained calm, kind, and patient. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He loosened his tie, suddenly feeling suffocated by it. For the first time in years, he didn't feel proud of his appearance. His expensive suit, his polished shoes, his gleaming watch, none of it seemed to matter anymore. Around him, other passengers were beginning to whisper. Some exchanged quiet smiles, clearly delighted to realize who was among them. A few even stole glances at Keanu, their faces glowing with admiration. The cabin, though hushed, carried an undercurrent of excitement now. Richard noticed how different their reactions were compared to his own. Where others saw humility, he had seen weakness. Where others felt admiration, he had felt annoyance. He realized, painfully, that he had been blind to the truth sitting right across from him. At one point, a flight attendant walked by with a tray of desserts. Richard declined without much thought, his appetite gone. Keanu, however, accepted a small piece of cheesecake, thanking her with that same soft kindness. It wasn't just gratitude, it was genuine warmth. Even the attendant's face softened, as though she had just been thanked by an old friend. Richard's chest tightened. He wished he could go back and erase his earlier behavior. But life didn't allow rewinds. He was stuck with his own actions, and the embarrassment grew heavier by the minute. After dessert, the cabin lights dimmed further, signaling that it was time for rest. A few passengers reclined their seats and closed their eyes. The atmosphere became quieter, almost serene. But Richard couldn't relax. His conscience wouldn't allow it. Every time he glanced across the aisle, he felt a sting of guilt. Keanu was now helping an older passenger adjust her overhead luggage, standing up with ease and gently guiding her suitcase into place. He didn't need to do it, an attendant would have happily assisted, but he moved before anyone else could. And when the woman thanked him, he simply smiled and said, "No problem at all." Richard's throat tightened. He realized that kindness wasn't something Keanu performed for show, it was simply who he was. Even with all his fame and fortune, he carried himself with the humility of an ordinary man. The businessman sank deeper into his seat, overwhelmed. He remembered all the times in his life when he had chosen pride over kindness, appearances over substance. He thought of business meetings where he had boasted, dinners where he had looked down on others, flights where he had judged passengers for the way they dressed. And now, sitting across from Keanu Reeves, he saw the mirror of his mistakes reflected back at him. Hours passed, but Richard remained restless. His heart battled between pride and regret. Finally, he gathered the courage to do something he rarely did, to admit he was wrong. He leaned slightly toward the aisle, his voice hesitant. "Excuse me," he said softly. Keanu looked up from his book, his calm eyes meeting Richard's. There was no trace of annoyance in them, only openness. I just wanted to apologize," Richard said, his voice low but sincere. "Earlier, I was unkind. I made comments I shouldn't have. I didn't realize who you were." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. Then he smiled gently and shook his head. "You don't need to apologize to me for that. I'm just another passenger, like you." Richard blinked, caught off guard. He had expected anger, or at least a hint of pride in being recognized. But there was none of that. Only humility. "I was wrong," Richard insisted, his voice cracking slightly. "Not just because of who you are, but because I judged you by appearances. That wasn't right." Keanu closed his book and placed it on the armrest. He leaned forward a little, his tone kind but firm. "We've all done that at some point. But it's never too late to see differently. First class, economy, it doesn't matter. We're all people. What matters is how we treat each other." The words sank deep into Richard's heart. They were simple, but they carried a truth he had ignored for too long. For a moment, there was silence. Richard nodded slowly, his eyes stinging with a feeling he hadn't experienced in years: humility. Other passengers, though pretending not to listen, had caught parts of the exchange. Some smiled softly, others looked thoughtful. The tension that had earlier hung in the cabin now melted into something warmer. Richard leaned back in his seat, his heart heavy but strangely lighter at the same time. The shame was still there, but alongside it was gratitude for the lesson, for the chance to see something differently. Keanu picked up his book again, as if nothing had happened, but his words lingered in the air. They had turned the cabin into something more than just a space for travel. It had become a quiet classroom of humility, kindness, and respect. Richard closed his laptop. For the rest of the flight, he didn't care about his work or his appearance. He sat quietly, reflecting. He realized that sometimes the most powerful lessons don't come from books or lectures but from the people sitting right in front of us, people who show us, through their actions, what truly matters. And for Richard, that lesson came from the man he had insulted, the man he had judged too quickly, the man who had shown him kindness in return. The cabin lights glowed faintly as the plane continued its journey through the night sky. Passengers drifted into sleep, but Richard stayed awake, his thoughts full. He knew this flight would not just take him to a city, it would take him to a new understanding of himself. And as Keanu Reeves turned another page of his book, his calm presence filled the cabin like quiet light, reminding everyone around him that true class has nothing to do with seats or suits, it comes from the heart. The hours of the long flight slowly passed, and the soft quietness of the cabin wrapped itself around the passengers. Some were asleep under their blankets, breathing peacefully. A few screens glowed faintly as movies played. The attendants walked quietly down the aisle, checking if anyone needed water or an extra pillow. The atmosphere was calm, almost like a floating hotel moving across the sky. Richard, however, was still wide awake. He sat in his seat with the window shade half open, staring at the stars outside. The vastness of the sky felt different tonight. For years, he had flown many times in first class, but this journey was unlike any other. It wasn't because of the comfortable seat or the fine meals. It was because of the lesson unfolding right in front of him. Across the aisle, Keanu Reeves rested quietly, his book now closed on the tray table. He wasn't sleeping, but he looked peaceful, his eyes half shut, as if he was simply enjoying the silence. Even in stillness, there was something about him, something calm, steady, and warm. He didn't look like a man who needed to prove anything to the world. He looked like someone who was free. Richard sighed softly. He thought back to the start of the flight, remembering how proud he had felt when he first boarded. He remembered how he had adjusted his tie and stretched his arms as if to claim the cabin. He remembered his smug remarks about people who don't belong here. And each memory now felt like a small sting in his chest. The regret was sharp, but alongside it was something else, a sense of awakening. For the first time in years, Richard realized how shallow he had been living. He had built his identity around expensive suits, polished shoes, luxury seats, and titles on business cards. But tonight, sitting across from Keanu Reeves, he realized those things meant very little. What mattered, he now saw, was how a person treated others. What mattered was kindness. The businessman leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engines wash over him. His thoughts drifted to his own life outside this plane. He thought of his employees, the ones he often rushed past without greeting properly. He thought of the young intern he had scolded last week for a small mistake. He thought of the waiters and drivers he had brushed aside because he believed they were beneath him. A lump formed in his throat. He realized he had been living in a bubble of arrogance, blind to the dignity of others. And yet, tonight, he had been given a chance to see differently. When the lights in the cabin brightened slightly for breakfast service, Richard felt as though a new light had entered his heart as well. He sat quietly, waiting for the attendants to serve the trays. When his meal arrived, he thanked the attendant not with his usual polite but cold nod, but with genuine gratitude. She noticed the difference, and her surprised smile only deepened his realization. Keanu, as always, was simple in his request. Just coffee and toast, nothing more. He thanked the attendant with the same warmth that never seemed to leave his voice. Richard watched, learning from every small action. For the first time in a long time, Richard didn't feel like showing off. He didn't order extra items, didn't make loud remarks. He simply ate quietly, reflecting on everything that had happened. As the plane prepared for landing, the captain's voice echoed softly through the speakers, announcing the descent. Passengers began to stir, collecting their belongings and fastening seatbelts. The end of the journey was near. Richard felt a nervous weight in his chest. He knew the flight was almost over, but the lesson would remain. He turned his head slightly, looking across the aisle one more time. Keanu Reeves was calmly packing his small backpack, sliding the worn book inside. His movements were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried a kind of grace Richard couldn't explain. Finally, with a deep breath, Richard spoke softly. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu looked up, meeting his eyes with that same gentle expression. "Yes." Richard hesitated for a moment, then said, "I just want to thank you." Not only for helping me with the papers, for being patient when I was rude, but for teaching me something I didn't even realize I needed to learn. Keanu tilted his head, his eyes calm. We all learn from each other, he replied kindly. That's what makes life meaningful. Richard nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. I've spent so much time trying to impress people, trying to prove I belong up here in first class. But watching you, I realize that true class has nothing to do with seats or suits. It's about kindness. Keanu gave a small, thoughtful smile. Kindness is free. And yet, it's the richest thing we can give. Those words stayed with Richard, echoing in his mind as the plane lowered through the clouds. When the aircraft finally touched down, passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to leave. Richard stood and carefully lifted his luggage, feeling strangely lighter than he had in years. Keanu helped an elderly man with his coat before stepping back politely to let others pass. Even as the cabin bustled with movement, his calm presence remained steady. As they walked off the plane, passengers stole quiet glances at Keanu, some whispering his name with excitement. Yet he moved humbly, blending into the crowd as if he were just another traveler. Richard followed behind, his heart filled with a mixture of admiration and humility. He knew he would likely never meet Keanu Reeves again, but he also knew this flight had changed something inside him forever. When he finally stepped into the bright terminal, the noise of the airport greeted him. People rushed past, announcements echoed, and the world carried on as usual. But inside Richard, something was different. He paused for a moment, setting down his bag, and took a deep breath. He promised himself that when he returned to his office, he would greet every employee with respect. He promised himself that the next time he sat in a restaurant, he would look the waiter in the eye and thank them sincerely. He promised himself that he would never again judge someone by their clothes, their seat, or their appearance. Because tonight, he had learned a lesson in the sky, one that no business deal, no luxury, and no title could ever teach. The man he had mocked had turned out to be one of the most admired and respected figures in the world. And yet, that man had shown him nothing but kindness. It wasn't the insult that defined the flight. It was the forgiveness. It was the quiet dignity. It was the reminder that true greatness shines not through wealth or fame but through humility. Richard lifted his bag again and walked toward the exit. He felt different, still the same man in a suit, but no longer the same man inside. And as the terminal lights glowed warmly above him, he carried with him a truth that would stay for the rest of his life: first class isn't measured by where you sit. It's measured by how you live, and how you treat the people around you.